So today we are going to be talking about evolution. So the major, I guess you could say, contributor to the theories of evolution that we have today was Darwin. Uh, a lot of you might know who Darwin was, um, and he pretty much created all the major evolutionary theories that we know now today. And he did this with like very little knowledge because at that time they had no understanding of genetic material, proteins, or anything like that. So he kind of just came up with this theory through a lot of observation. So looking at the ideas that led up to Darwin, the first was during the ancient Greek times. Um, an idea was proposed by Aristotle, and pretty much he proposed that all species are viewed almost like on a ladder. So uh, all of these species are either complex or not complex, and the most complex ones are therefore the most superior ones, the most divine ones, and I guess you'd say like the most godly ones. So we were at the top based on his ladder, and pretty much all other animals were lower and lower. Then those that were non-motile, like plants, were even lower, and so on. So that was one of the first theories of just evolution. And then Aristotle also believed that we are becoming ever more complex throughout, history, and so pretty much we're always moving up the ladder in some sense. So fossils, right? So fossils was the next big piece of evidence for evolution. So when archaeology came about, a lot of people started looking at fossils, and they realized that the species that they saw in fossils were very unrelated in some sense to the ones that we see today. So this was another theory of change in organisms that happened throughout time, just because of the fact that when you actually looked at the fossils, you could physically see the change in bone structure, in the organization of bones, things like that. And so these fossils were known centuries before Darwin. So people knew that animals changed centuries before Darwin, but Darwin kind of came up with a nice solid process for how that happens. So the next big theory was associated with Lamarck, and this is of acquired traits. So again, it's very similar, and it tries to explain how organisms change. So pretty much, Lamarck said that if you have an organism, and let's say giraffes, for example, if you have a giraffe, then a giraffe needs to use its long neck to reach like leaves on trees that are very large. So Lamarck said that okay, these giraffes, what they're going to do is they're going to start growing their neck, and so like this kind of seems weird, but he pretty much said that if an animal needs a trait, it will develop that trait automatically, and then it will pass it on to its offspring. So so this is the famous example where you have the giraffe stretching its neck, and then it passes on that characteristics of a stretched neck to its offspring. So this model is completely false. And the reason for the fact that it's completely false is because, first of all, giraffes, can't just suddenly start stretching their neck and increase their neck length by like 10 feet or something like that. That just doesn't happen. The other thing is that, you can't pass on these kind of traits, even acquired traits, to your offspring. This is because acquired traits, which are kind of like traits that you acquired during your life, these traits, they're only in the somatic cells of your body. You remember the somatic cells are the body cells, and these are not passed on. The only cells that are passed on are the gametes. So if you have a change in characteristics of a gamete, it's going to be passed on. But with Lamarck, he postulated that change in somatic cells is going to be passed on. Now, obviously, at this time, he had no knowledge of somatic cells or gametes or anything like that. So this was just a theory that he came up with through observation, but it ended up being false. So the next is geology. So the major, as you could say, enthusiast of geology was Lyell, and he was a uniformitarianism, and he studied the ancient Earth. So pretty much, he started to think about, how geology works, pretty much, and how the Earth's core and crust changes throughout time. So Lyell saw that, when he dated rocks, um, pretty much uniformitarianism is that like you have a like you could say it's pretty much like just the study of rocks. It's just the change in rocks over time. And so if you actually look at like the Earth's crust, you'll see these very distinct, almost layers of Earth. And with that, you can study, changes in the Earth and what happened to the Earth. So that's what uniformitarianism is, just studying change in the Earth through rocks. So another kind of theory of evolution was like artificial selection. So artificial selection is not really like a theory that people came up with of evolution, but it was more of a process that we use consistently, even now. And what artificial selection is like think of humans as God, and we are changing traits of animals that we find favorable. So for example, let's say in the, 1000 BCE, people were starting to, settle down and starting to domesticate animals. So if you come across a pack of wild cows, you're probably not going to take those cows in because they're wild. It's a danger to you. But if you find a pack of very like loyal cows, calm cows, cows that are cows that have traits that we are looking for, then you're going to take in those cows and use them to produce resources. So this is what artificial selection is. So we almost have changed animals to show traits that we like. So we took wolves and we domesticated them into dogs because we found the wolves that were loyal or those that were not harmful. And in some sense, we allowed them to breed, we gave them resources, and over time, it created a whole lineage of dogs. So this has been done with like a lot of vegetables too. I know that they don't mention it here, but if you actually look at like a wild banana, it's first of all, it's really, really sour. Like the fruit inside is very, very sour. Secondly, the husk on the outside is insanely thick. Like it's really hard to actually break open. So that again shows domestication. Some humans found bananas that were sweeter on the inside, easier to peel, and they started, planting those seeds. Then over time, they took, the sweetest one, the one with the smallest husks, and continued to plant those seeds until eventually you had a population of actual like sweet bananas. So that's how we can change, or we ourselves can change the nature of and traits of organisms. So we don't really need to talk about population limits, but it was just a theory on how, how populations kind of grow. So it was invented by Thomas Malthus, and pretty much what he did was he described something called the carrying capacity. And with a population of organisms, they have a certain limit to how large they can grow. So, for example, if you have a population of cows, you can't have infinite cows, right? Because eventually the cows are going to run out of space. There's not going to be enough food. There's not going to be enough water, and so on. So Malthus defines the carrying capacity of a population as that limit where that population cannot exceed that value because there's not enough resources or space or some other limiting factor that would inhibit the growth of that population. So now so these are all just theories of evolution prior to Darwin. So looking at Darwin himself, he got trained in field biology, and he decided to go on a trip to the South American and islands in South America, and he traveled to the South Pacific too. He took like a really, really long route. So pretty much what he did was he was a naturalist. And what this means was he just collected and cataloged thousands of species of plants and animals. And he did this for like 5 years. So he had a lot of data in the organisms that he found. So he mainly investigated one island, and he's really known for this island. Those are the Galapagos Islands. So it's right on the west of Ecuador, maybe like 100 to 200 miles out, and he found that the species in the Galapagos were very similar to the species in South America. And this was weird, right? Because you have this random island floating in the middle of the ocean, and yet the species found on this island are similar to the species on the mainland. So when he actually looked at the anatomy of these species, he found that the actual anatomy of all of these species, again, very similar to the mainland species. So pretty much what this showed was that the idea, or Lamarck's idea, that characteristics are just acquired and then they're passed on, it kind of just doesn't make sense based on the data that Darwin found. So Darwin also kind of published his work then, or what he found on the islands, and he came up with a theory. He published it, and he published a book called On the Origins of Species in 1859. So let's take a closer look at what Darwin actually proposed. So his main theory is called natural selection. And pretty much what this is that favorable characteristics in a population are supported, and those that are not are going to be terminated in the population. So he said, to any population, there are 4 steps in evolution. The first is overproduction. And this, going back to the cow example with Malthus and whole population limits, overproduction is when a species produces more offspring than the environment can handle. So obviously some of those species, some of those offspring are going to die. The other thing that he said was variation. That means that individuals in a single population are going to vary. This means that, well, if you look at humans in general, right, we have everybody is different in some way. This is what variation is. And he also said that some of this variation is heritable. And unlike Lamarck and his theory, Darwin explained that variation some of the variation is heritable. Some characteristics are heritable, but the majority are not. And if you think back to our lectures on DNA, we talked about something called mutations. Now, mutations are just sporadic changes in the DNA due to errors in the copying or anything like that. So variation is primarily caused by these mutations in DNA. So this is how the majority of new characteristics in a population come about. And that's due to just mutations in DNA. Now, another aspect of any population is competition. So all of the individuals in that population are going to compete for limited resources. Remember that there is overproduction, so not all offspring are going to survive. So the ones that are most competitive are going to have the greatest chance of surviving. And the final thing that matters is differential reproductive success. So individuals that possess more favorable characteristics are more likely to survive and reproduce, and those with less favorable characteristics are less likely to survive and reproduce. So what does this mean? Pretty much differential reproductive success means that if, let's say, you have a species of rabbits, and the rabbits are being hunted by these wolves. So the rabbits that are able to run away the fastest are most likely going to survive. So in that population of rabbits, being able to run fast is a favorable characteristic. However, if you are slow, that is a less favorable characteristic. So those with favorable characteristics, meaning they're able to run away faster, are more likely to survive, and this means they're more likely to reproduce. Those with less favorable characteristics are less likely to survive, probably because they're going to get caught, they're going to be less competitive for resources, and so on. So thus, natural selection will take a population of individuals and make them more suited to their environment through time. So I want to emphasize something here, and that is population. Natural selection, evolution in general, only occurs in populations. It does not occur at the individual level. So this is where the theories of Lamarck and Darwin really differ, because Lamarck said that each individual can change their characteristics to make themselves more suited to their environment. Darwin disagreed. He said that a certain population will change over time, and the individuals in that population will change over time to make themselves more suited to their environment. So you don't have to know that speciation. I mean, I guess you could. So you have in speciation, this is something, it's just the creation of new species. So this happens due to a change in environment between two existing populations. So for example, if you have a population of frogs in the Amazon rainforest, and suddenly a tsunami comes and creates like a new river, and the frogs are not able to cross this river. Well, now you have two different populations that are isolated. You have one population on one side of the river and one population on the other. Now, the environment in each of these sides might change. For example, a predator of the frogs might appear on one side, while the frogs might have better reproductive success on the other. So now you have a completely different environment. What does this mean? Well, that means that in each of these different populations of isolated frogs, different characteristics are considered favorable. So in the population that's being heavily preyed upon, you might want to have, the frogs are probably going to be better camouflaged to prevent themselves from being eaten. But those frogs that, are, in not being predated on, they're just going to live their life. If any environmental, changes occur, like suddenly they start getting large storms or something, then that's what they're going to need to adapt to. So that's how speciation occurs. And eventually what's going to happen over like a long, long time is that these two different isolated frog species can create, or two different isolated frog populations can create new species. And how do we define a new species? So a new species is just when those two populations cannot interbreed. And what this means is that, if you took one frog from one population and one frog from another, and you tried to get them to mate, they would not be able to. And therefore, they are now a different species. So now we are able to define two terms, microevolution and macroevolution. So microevolution is a change in a population over time. So for example, if a frog population is being heavily preyed upon and it develops more camouflage skin, that is microevolution. It's just a change in a trait. Now, macroevolution is a formation of a species. So now, if you have those same frogs with that, camouflage color, and now they're not able to mate with, those old frogs that they came from, then that would be macroevolution because it's the creation of a new species. So this is Darwin's theory. So let's look at evidence, or why we consider Darwin's theory correct, right? Because how do we know? Well, there's a lot of like different pieces of evidence that show us that, Darwin was correct. So the first piece of evolution or evidence supporting evolution is the fossil record. So the fossil shows direct evidence for change over time. With fossils, there's so many different like fossils you can like actually find. For example, like the classic fossils like bone, teeth, and shells, those rich with calcium, are most commonly thought of. But actual body parts like entire mosquitoes can be preserved in things like bogs, tar, amber, ice. These things can preserve and prevent the breakdown of skin, soft tissues through the prevention of getting or letting bacteria inside. So fossils actually show evidence of intermediates between extinct forms of animals and animals that are still living today. So why does this support Darwin? Well, if you think back to Darwin's theory, he said that, populations change over time. And so if you look at a population, um, based on what Darwin said that, the individuals that have favorable characteristics are more likely to survive. Now, this does not mean that all animals with unfavorable characteristics are going to die. It just means that the majority of animals surviving are going to be animals that have these favorable characteristics. But this means that over time, after you go through multiple generations of these organisms, eventually the population will be filled with organisms with favorable characteristics. But again, this takes time, it takes generations, and this is why when you go outside from, 1 hour to the next, you're not going to see evolution. So this is why Darwin's theory is supported through the fossil record. So another thing that we can do to show this is we can date fossils. So if anybody knows about radiometric dating here, it's a process where, different isotopes of elements, some are radioactive. And what this means is that they undergo decay at constant rates. So for example, potassium-40 decays to argon-40 at a specific rate. So, this could mean that in 40 days, you'll have all of the potassium-40 being decayed to argon-40. So now let's say you want to measure how long that rock has been around. So what you can do is you can go to that rock, measure the ratio of potassium-40 to argon-40, and this will allow you to figure out how old that rock is based on the time passed. So that's what radiometric dating is. It's pretty much that we can actually figure out how old something is based on the ratios of certain molecules. Now, another thing we can use in fossils is index fossils. So index fossils are fossils that have been dated, so we can actually tell if something is in the same layer, how old that certain fossil is. And now another thing we can use is the relative position in rock layers. So organisms that are at the top of the soil are going to be the youngest, and organisms buried deep in Earth's crust are going to be the oldest. So that's a way we can tell, the actual relative position in rock layers. So there are hundreds of well-studied fossil sites, and that have been dated in some way. So fossils are a really actually accurate way of measuring how old something is, just because of the amount of ways we can use to date them and figure out how old something is. So we can also compare the anatomy of organisms to others. So, this is looking at, an entire community of organisms, not just a single population, but we can also see common evolutionary origin. Because if you remember when we talked just about like evolution, we also talked about speciation, the creation of new species from a single common ancestor. So some, traits or structures are conserved throughout evolution. So for example, the original mammal, right, like the OG mammal that was like maybe like the first mammal on Earth, it had certain characteristics that we still have today. And so do, dolphins, and so do pigs, and so do cows. Now, we're thinking, why are we saying that? Like, how is a dolphin flipper related to a human arm? Well, if you actually look at the structure of a dolphin flipper and a human arm, you'll actually see that the structure is very similar. For example, we have like the humerus bone in the arm, then we have like a radius and an ulna, and then we have all the phalanges. If you actually look at a dolphin flipper, it's pretty much very, very similar. They also have a long bone, or not a really long bone, all of their bones are much smaller, but they also have like a bone that's very similar to our humerus. They have two bones similar to the radius and ulna, and they have, end bones similar to phalanges. Same thing with bats' wings. So those are what homologous structures are. They're structures that are, anatomically similar, but they have different functions. Like the human arm is used to, grasp things like that, while the dolphin flipper is to swim, and the bat wing is to fly. So that's the difference, or that's what homologous structures are. And so this demonstrates that, we have, or it shows that there is a common evolution, or there is evolution occurring because of these homologous structures. Now, there's another type of structure called vestigial structures. And vestigial structures are, things in organisms that once had a function, but do not anymore. For example, in humans, we consider the appendix a vestigial structure because, to our knowledge, it has no function whatsoever in the human body. So, what does this show? So, it shows that natural selection will automatically lead to the termination of the function of these structures. So, for example, if the appendix, through evolution, in the environment, the appendix is no longer favorable to organisms, well, then what's going to happen? What's going to happen is the animals are going to start to use the appendix less and less, leading to it being left behind. So this is why we say that vestigial structures have been left behind. So there's also something called analogous structures. Now, analogous structures differ from homologous structures in the sense that analogous structures are when you have, two different organisms that develop similar function in their, I guess you could say, or they develop I guess you could say, two limbs with similar function, but the actual structure of those limbs differ greatly. So, for example, an insect's wing and a bird wing, they both have the same function to fly, but the insect's wing has a completely different structure than a bird's wing. So, with the knowledge of homologous structures and analogous structures, we can define two types of evolution. So what we have here is divergent and convergent evolution. So divergent evolution shown here is when you have a single organism, and then it develops into two different species. But remember that we said with divergent evolution, you have the same anatomical structure of that feature, but the function is different. So this is divergent evolution, where you have a single common ancestor structure, and it diverges to produce different functions. Now, convergence is when you have two completely different structures, and they develop the same function over time. So what you're going to actually end up with is the same function, but a different structure. So that's the difference between divergent and convergent evolution. So just remember that convergent evolution will always produce analogous structures, and divergent evolution always produces homologous structures. So the next thing that proves evolution is something called biogeography. So biogeography looks at almost how organisms are kind of spread out throughout the earth. So for example, if you look at the plant species in, some of Europe and North America, you'll see a lot of similarities in the plant species, or specifically in the fossils of those plant species. And this shows us that, certain, plants were once on both of these islands until it split. So this is an example, or an example of this besides plant species is the dominance of marsupials in Australia. And the reason for this is because marsupials in Australia, you know, are only really found in Australia. They're not really found anywhere else on the planet. And so the reason for this is because if you actually look at, you know, the fossil record, you'll see that marsupials are actually in the fossil record in places like India, you know, Southeast Asia, and places like that. So what actually happened was the marsupials kind of died out in these areas just because of the fact that it was not favorable for their living. And the only place that was favorable was Australia. So that's where they started to grow. So that's what biogeography is. It looks at like the placement of organisms throughout Earth, compares them to explain the fossil record and evolution. So the next thing is, or next piece of evidence is development. So if you actually look at embryos of reptiles, birds, mammals, and humans, they're pretty much indistinguishable. And this demonstrates that, you know, we're all related because our embryos are so similar. And I guess you could say the final piece of evidence is the molecular tests. So molecular tests and molecular comparisons look at the DNA and the, I guess you could say, how close that DNA is related. So literally what you can do, if you can look at the genomes of organisms, or you can look at specific genes in organisms and compare how similar they are. So for example, humans and chimpanzees have like a 98% sequence identity, while humans and bananas only have like a 50% similarity. So that shows you that humans are much more closely related to chimpanzees than they are to bananas. So that's why we use the DNA, because it really gives us a really good understanding of evolution, how genes evolved. And if you remember, we talked about mutations being the primary way that evolution works. So because we're looking at DNA, we're going to see these mutations firsthand. And this gives us an understanding of how these organisms evolved and, you know, what they evolved into, and so on and so forth. So what we can actually use to, I guess, map out these similarities and relationships is a phylogenetic tree. And a phylogenetic tree, you've probably all seen it. It's kind of just like a tree that shows the relationship of organisms and how they've evolved and how they have descended. And it pretty much just is based off of DNA and protein sequencing. Similarities between those are used to understand how similar organisms are. So there's something now which you guys don't have to know, but it's good to know, and it's kind of called the NeoDarwinism. So if you remember what I said at the beginning, that Darwin, he kind of didn't have any understanding of what genetics was. Because if you remember, Mendel came up with his theories of genetics around the same time that Darwin published his theories. So Darwin really did not know how to apply Mendel's theories of genetics into his theory of evolution. So Darwin kind of just made his assumption and wrote his book off of observations that he had through his trip. But now we actually look at genetics and we combine that with Darwin's theory to produce something called NeoDarwinism, or just, you know, a new theory of evolution. So that is evolution in a nutshell. Do you guys have any questions for it? Okay. Well, if there's no questions, that's all I have prepared for today. So we will be having our next class next week, and then we will have another class after that, and that will be the end of our series and our class. So if you guys don't have any questions, thank you for attending, and I will see you guys